Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'm happy to see that many of you have heard me before, and I'm not sure what's your problem why you're coming again. But so I will not repeat what I've done before. I'm going to build on what I've done before and get down and to details, assuming that most of you have heard some of my talks about the architecture of cognition, about issues of cognitive load, mental representations that we've talked about. If you haven't heard me before, don't worry, I'll try to make myself semi-comprehensible. To remind you, last time, a year ago, or other occasions, I critiqued the sign here because it's learning technology. And the technology is very big and the learning is very small, where I try to make the point, and obviously they haven't taken me very seriously, that the learning should be big and the technology should be small, because one of the problems in e-learning is that the technology drives it and not the learning. And the point that I made is that the technology is subservient to the learner and the learning. The technology is there not as a goal, but as a tool to get the message across. So they haven't changed it, but I've definitely kept this logo. And we're talking about the learning, and we're talking about the learner. That is the main objective. And I'm going to give 2 talks today, but we will stop in the middle so people have an opportunity to escape if you don't want to stay for the second talk. We're going to talk about building a learning that you cannot forget, because in most cases, we will agree that if we teach people, not necessarily even in e-learning, we want them to remember. We don't want them to tick a box. I've done this module, I passed the exam, and a day later I forgot it. And in most cases, when we do research, we find that people forget 70, 80% of what they've learned within 24 hours. Why bother teaching them if they're not going to remember it? Just a quick note to show you that I've crossed out Southampton University because I'm leaving the university. It's my last 2 days at the university, so I still have it here, and my email is still active, and my web address. And a lot of the material that I will cover is on my web address here. I'll put it on in the end. So given that we want people to remember what they've learned, and given that there's a lot of expertise here in the crowd, what determines whether people are going to remember? So when you design e-learning or just normal training, face-to-face, a booklet, you want people to remember. And I hope that you think about it, and what do you do to ensure or to enhance that people will remember what they've learned, not only acquire it, but remember the information. What do you do? The expertise in this room is huge, so why don't you tell me what do you do? What kind of things do you do? Make it interesting, good. Make it relevant. Interactive. Drawing on previous knowledge. Consolidate, good. Repetition of the information. Make them use it, practice it. So all the things you're saying are good things. And I would divide them and other stuff to things relevant to the people themselves, things relevant to the material, and then things relevant of how you deliver and how you package the material to the people. So what determines if people are going to remember? There are things about the person themselves, individual differences, abilities, a fact of life. Don't blame the messenger. Some people have bigger brains than others. If you take 2 people and you teach the same information, some are going to remember more and some are going to remember less because there's individual differences in brain capacities. Different ages have implications. Gender and a lot of other issues of who the people who are studying is going to affect how, if and how much and what they remember. Then there are issues of motivation. Now, motivation, I didn't put it in individual difference because motivation is one of the things that you can affect by the way you deliver the e-learning or any kind of learning. You can affect motivation. However, ability It's very hard to change, and you cannot change it a lot. Age, we spend a lot of time and energy, but we're stuck with it. And gender, again, we go to great pain to change it if we want to. Basically, these things are who we are, and they don't change. So this is a lot of personal variables, and I left one open because it's not a comprehensive list, but these are the kind of variables that relate who the people are. Then you have about the material itself. The relevance of the material, for example, people mention that. If it's more relevant, then people are going to remember it more. The complexity, how simple or how complex the actual material can affect if they remember it in a very complicated way. Sometimes more complex material is remembered more, but sometimes more simple material is remembered more. So it's a complex issue of complexity. And then there's a bunch of variables. Again, it's not a comprehensive list of cognitive load, for example. Mental representations, if they form the right mental representations, are going to remember it better than if they form other mental representations, which may make no difference immediately after the learning. The same amount of information is acquired, but certain mental representations are robust in the long term. Feedback, this is very, very new research, that feedback can enhance memory if it is unexpected. So when the learner expects to get feedback and they get it, they forget it, like all the material. But during training, give them feedback when they don't expect it, and this they remember for a very long time. So when they're doing the training, at some stage, give them feedback when they're not ready for it, they will remember it more. There's new research about it. And there's a lot of other issues. We can do a whole talk, maybe. I'm not sure they'll want me here next year, but if they do, we can do a whole talk on feedback, how to give feedback in a very constructive way, and it can increase memory and control. Pertains to interactivity and other issues that people have control. It affects stuff like that. Of course, I'd like to say that all these interact together. They're not isolated. When you have more control, then it motivates you, and so on and so forth. So all these different variables interact and affect one another. Today I'm going to talk about one aspect. We're barely scratching the tip of the iceberg in half an hour, but I will cover a topic that will address control, cognitive load, complexity, motivation, and individual differences, specifically on aging. So what did I do? I did an experiment. I'm a scientist, not a normal scientist who sits in the lab, like in the basement and does experiments. I do that too, but I take it to the real world and see what are the implications and applications of it. So I do an experiment, a scientific experiment, and we take the same teaching material. We take a corpus that people need to learn and teach it to a number of learners, in this case 180 different people, but we manipulate how we deliver the information, how we package it. We randomly assign them to different conditions to see the effectiveness and the implications of different ways to deliver learning. In this experiment, it's one experiment that I'll mention to you today, we manipulated the layout. So we took learning material that was composed of 8 topics, unrelated. Sometimes topics relate to one another and have a certain hierarchy. You have to do addition before multiplication. So we took 8 topics independent. And a third of the learners had a web design. We call it linear layout. So they had one topic at a time, and they were next to each other like a train. So people could only choose go to the topic on the left or go to the topic on the right. They had very minimal control on the order of presentation of the learning material, the 8 pieces of information. We have what we call an index page, a star layout, which is like a portal. They have the index with the 8 topics. They click on a topic, and they get a page with the information. When they're done, they go back to the main index page and click on another topic, and they go back and forth as many times as they want to. And the third condition, we call it interconnected layout, where they get the information, but on the same page, they have all the other topics, and they can click on any one, and then it will bring that information on board. So in this specific experiment, we took 180 people and did a manipulation and divided them randomly to the 3 conditions and had them learn the material. And the first thing we did is test how well they acquired and remembered the information when we did immediate recall tests. So immediately after training, they got tests to assess how well they understood and remembered right away the information on the 8 topics conveyed in this experiment. Then we did tests for the longer term, how they retain it. In this experiment, we did it 2 weeks later. In another experiment, I'll talk in the second session, we did 6 weeks. So what is long term depends on a lot of issues, but here we tested them again 2 weeks later. We also wanted to see if this affects complexity, because it could be that one structure is good for simple information, but another structure is better for complex information. So we did all of this experiment twice. One time, each of the 8 topics had relatively simple information, and another time, with another group of learners, we made it much more complicated. It was much more information and more complicated information in each one of the 8 topics. We also were interested in age. So the first time we did it with what we call younger learners. They were about 18 years old, 18, 19. And then we did it with older, I did old, but then changed it to older, people in their 60s. We took a bunch of people in their 60s, whether the same findings which apply to the simple and the complex, short-term, long-term. And we took many other measurements. And if people are interested, I can send you the paper. It's a long technical paper. For example, overall time. There was no time constraint. So each learner could study the pages as many times as they want to. So we have measurements of the overall time. We look how much time they spend per page, because 2 learners on 2 different designs may have the same overall time, but what is the distribution? Maybe in one case, they spend more or less the same amount of time on the same 8 topics, whether in another formation, there's a very big variance. They spend a lot of time on one page, but not on another page. Repetitions, how many times they went back to the same page, to the same topic. Maybe they've read it once and never go back. Many times they go again and again, so looking at that. And user experience, how do you feel, and all this kind of a more subjective user experience information. So, and you see this experiment looks at control, because in the linear there's basically no control, but in the full layout they can control what they see. Cognitive load is controlled between the simple and complex, but also when they have control, and control is good, but it increases cognitive load. When you have no control, you focus on the learning. When you have control, you have to decide what I want to do, and that takes some of cognitive, so that can be bad. Complexity. Motivation, maybe when they have control, they have more motivation because they're choosing the topics, they're more engaged. And we looked at age between younger people and older people. So what did we find in this study? I'm going to give you the kind of the big findings, but it gets quite messy and complicated. So first of all, let me ask you, I'm not going to use a sophisticated technology. The shoemaker walks barefoot, so we'll use our old hand. And wondering if you think that the linear layout was better, the star layout, or the interconnected layout. So who thinks people learned and remember better in the linear layout? Pick your hand up. Who thinks people remember better in the portal index layout? Who thinks people learn better in the fully interconnected layout? Okay, interesting intuitions. So let's see what the actual findings are. First of all, when you do science, things are a bit messy, and I'll try to clean it up. It still will look quite messy, but this is after the cleanup. First of all, we found that there was no difference in the immediate recall. Only 2 weeks after that, we found the difference between the designs. So when we tested immediately after the learning, there was no difference regardless of the 3 layouts. Only 2 weeks later, when we tested, there was an effect of the layouts. And again, my intuition, I won't tell you what it is, but not to be biased, I don't score the exams. I have research assistants get a bunch of exams and test quiz. They don't know which condition, and they just score them. So it's done totally objectively. So the first interesting fact is, one, no difference immediately when you test people, which is what we all do in e-learning. We test people immediately after learning. However, 2 weeks later, we found a difference. Banfaroni test, this is ANOVA, analysis of variance for people who care, probably nobody. Banfaroni test revealed that participants recalled significantly more information which was presented in the linear layout than the fully connected one. The linear one that nobody voted for, they did. You can feel good that immediately in recall, you were not right, but you were not wrong, because there was no difference. But 2 weeks later, the linear, which is very anti-intuitive also for me initially, were the best one that they did. And we can discuss it why. Why, I can tell you my interpretation, but my interpretation is an interpretation. The data is undisputable. Why I have my view, you don't have to accept them, is, for example, that when you have control, you spend a lot of time deciding what you want to do, rather than on the material. When you just get the material, you just study it and take it on board and focus your resources. Another interesting thing that we found an interaction between recall time, immediate or 2 weeks, and the complexity, the simple and complex material. We found that immediately testing, people remembered better in the simple condition. So if we just looked at the simple complex, immediately after testing, people who had simple information remembered more and acquired more than the complex condition. But 2 weeks later, this effect was gone. There was no difference. Here you can see, for example, the issue of cognitive load in the ability. It could be that our learners were not very capable. So when it was complex, it was just too much for them to study. And when we gave them less information, simple information, they picked up and learned more in the immediate recall. What's interesting is that 2 weeks later, there was no difference. So immediate, simple, complex. 2 weeks later, the same. We didn't test later. It could be that if we test 6 weeks later or 2 months later, the complex would have been higher than the simple. So the simple was degrading after 2 weeks and they met. Would it continue or did it stay the same later? We haven't tested. We don't have the data. And after 2 weeks, there was no difference between the simple and complex. So I'm going very quickly because usually I like to talk for many hours and I have only half an hour for this. So what are the conclusions from all of this? Because it really depends on the learning material, on the time delay, on the learners, on a lot of the variables. First of all, it is, am I allowed to say damn? Is it damn complicated. If I'm not, it's not so simple. And sometimes it's not worth the effort. You develop a training module, e-learning web page or not, and you don't have to get it right. But if it's something you're going to use for a long time, for many learners, you want to get it right, but it's not simple. It's very complicated issues, and you've just seen the tip of the iceberg, that even if we tried 3 different designs, we don't have a lot of answer because it depends on the complexity of the material and depends how much time you test and so on and so forth. But my message is that you need to do the research to make informed decisions based on the science of how to do it correctly. Intuition is not always right. And today, by chance, most of your intuition was not correct. Most of you believe that the fully interconnected will be better, and no, the linear. This research is not rocket science. It doesn't take a lot of time. But if you're designing an e-learning that's spending a lot of money on that thousands of people are going to use, or tens of thousands, you might as well do some experimentation to find out which is the best way to do it. I know the practical world, they come and say, we need in 2 weeks to roll it out, and you have no time to do anything. But this is what you need to do if you can do. And you need to collect the right data. What is the right data? It really depends on the application. So we did 2 weeks, but maybe 2 weeks is very long. What they need to learn only for a week. Maybe it's people who are learning how to work on an airplane and they're going to work in this airline for 5-10 years. So you want to make sure you test after 5-10 years and do measures that are appropriate. Maybe you want to test how well they remember it on the job. Do they apply it? So you need to think what are the right measurements, and just having a test at the end of the learning and they answered 70% and you tick the box that they've done it is a ticking box exercise, but not really thinking what the right measurements that you really want to get. And when you do it, then later people complain they don't remember, they go back to the workplace, there's no real impact. And no wonder, because we don't collect the data and make informed decisions about that. The material, the delivery of the material, the packaging affects learning and memory. It is critical. And here we did a very small experiment. You can think of expanding it very easily, not to if you do it linear or fully connected, but do you use figures and graphs or only text? If you use a figure, do you use a bar graph or a line graph or a pie chart? What colors do you use in the pie chart? If you think all of this is not important, it's not affecting learning and memory, it is, it's critical. And maybe, in some cases, like here, that you can do all of them and do an experiment, and immediately after training, it had no effect, whether you use the bar graph or line graph or only text. But maybe a day later, well, all the research, not only mine, show that people forget 70%. In one condition, they'll forget 70%. In another one, they'll forget 20%. So it may be very critical if you test a day later or 2 weeks later. So this is a very important decision that you need to make when you design your e-learning. And right now, I dare say, and please tell me I'm wrong, that in most cases, we don't do it properly, not because we don't want to, there's a lot of constraints, but we don't go and test. Audio. Do you want audio? Do you want text? Do you want audio and text together? And I can go on, and every step that you take in designing the delivery of the material, leaving what the material is, leaving what the person is, you can package it in different ways. And you hit an intersection every 2 seconds. Even if you're not aware, you can do it this way and you can do it that way. So why do you do it one way or the other way? Based on your experience and intuition, which is good. But we do not, I'll say it in the best way I can, probably not a very good way, we do not bring e-learning and the learning technology to its capability. Overall, it's not delivering what it can. And many people are saying e-learning is no good. And it's not that e-learning is not good. The way e-learning is used today, in many cases, I won't even say most cases, but in many cases doesn't live to the potential because we don't utilize it properly, because we don't make decisions based on research and understanding of these issues. And today I'm just covering a very specific angle, very detailed, because last time, that most of you heard, we talked about general principles of cognition, of attention, of visual search, allocation of resources, and general issues that many people, and you are aware, are not even aware of that. What is the brain relevant? That's why I bring the brain, because people say, why is it relevant to e-learning? The e-learning is about the material. No, or the learning objective. No, it's about the learner. What do they pick up and what they remember and learn? So if you want more information about this specific experiment or anything else, it's on my website. Here is my email. And thank you very much.